Hedonism is a monistic theory of the good life. It claims that there's one and only one thing that makes life good, namely pleasure. However, many people find this unconvincing. Pleasure matters, but it does not matter exclusively. What else contributes to life's goodness? The philosopher John Stuart Mill had an answer that you might find useful when you ponder on the problem of the ideal city. Mill took himself for a hedonist. It's not quite clear whether he really was, but this is not so important in our context. What is important, though, is an innovation that he introduced into the theory of the good. This innovation is sometimes called the informed preference test. Classical hedonism conceived pleasure in purely quantitative terms. The source of pleasure is irrelevant. In contrast, Mill's starting point was the observation that we differentiate between pleasures, not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality. For instance, the joy of being in Hong Kong differs qualitatively from the pleasure of being in Sydney. Mill's second observation was that people prefer some kinds of pleasure in virtue of the quality of the joyful experience. This confronts us with the question whether such rankings of pleasures are purely a matter of taste, or whether some pleasurable experiences are objectively better than others. Here, Mill's informed preference test comes into play. If we want to know whether one kind of pleasure is better than another, we need the judgment of people who experienced both. Mill called such people competent judges. If we want to compare the pleasure of being in Hong Kong with the pleasure of being in Sydney, we rely on the judgment of people who know both cities and experience being there as pleasurable. Mind you, people who hate either city or both of them are not competent in judging the pleasure of being there. So, competent judges know what they're talking about from their own experience. Second, competent judges are not influenced by social conventions or moral considerations. For example, a competent judge who wants to know whether the joy of being in Las Vegas is better than the joy of being in Rome will ignore that some people find the enjoyments of Las Vegas vulgar or that the city is such a nightmare for the environment. They will focus on the question of pleasurableness and cancel out the distorting effect of our conventional moral views. Now the test can begin. The competent judges will ask themselves whether one kind of pleasure is such that they would not give it up entirely for an infinite amount of the other pleasure. Let us try out the tests ourselves. Probably we are all familiar with the joy of being in the countryside and with the joy of being in a city. Now, ask yourself whether you would be willing to sacrifice one enjoyment, for instance, being in the countryside, for an infinite amount of the other, namely being in the city. Would you pay the price of never being in the countryside again for the joy of being in the city, but not vice versa? Let's assume you would. Then, according to Mill, you rank being in the city as a higher pleasure. If all or almost all competent judges agree with you, we have an empirical basis for claiming that being in the city is, indeed, a higher pleasure. Mill was profoundly convinced that the pleasure rankings of competent judges follow a particular pattern. In his words, humans give a most marked preference to the manner of existence which employs their higher faculties. I shall call this the Millian principle. People who experience the joy of mastering complex activities would not be willing to give up access to these enjoyments entirely, even if they would get an infinite amount of plain pleasure in return. This might help us to understand why we do not consider Drugtown as an ideal city. If Mill's empirical claim is correct, and I think it is, human beings have a strong interest in developing their faculties and in improving their skills, be it as a footballer, as a carpenter, or as a philosopher. Of course, not all people seem to be committed to excellence and self-improvement. Mill was quite aware of that, and he had a plausible explanation for it. Many people never get the chance of experiencing the higher pleasures of applying more developed faculties. they are trapped in suboptimal ways of life. This is why free and equal access to educational and professional opportunities and a rich and inspiring cultural environment is so important. What is the role of education and equal opportunity in your ideal city?